Let's walk through malware types and indicators you'll need to recognize for the Security Plus exam. Malware questions are extremely common on the exam, and they are usually presented as scenarios where you must identify the type of malicious software based on its behavior. The key is recognizing what the malware is trying to do and how it spreads. We'll begin with one of the oldest and most recognizable malware types. If a scenario describes malicious code attaching itself to legitimate files or programs and spreading when users execute those files, you are dealing with a virus. A virus requires user interaction in order to spread. For example, an employee downloads an infected email attachment and opens the file. The malicious code activates and begins infecting additional files on the computer. That behavior is characteristic of a virus. A common exam trap is confusing viruses with worms. The key difference is that viruses require user action, while worms spread automatically. Now let's move into worms, because this distinction is heavily tested. If the question describes malware that spreads automatically across networks without user interaction, you are dealing with a worm. Worms self-replicate and spread independently. For example, a worm may exploit a network vulnerability and rapidly infect multiple computers throughout an organization without anyone clicking or opening anything. Worms are especially dangerous because they can spread extremely quickly across large environments. Now let's transition into Trojan horses. If a scenario describes malware disguised as legitimate software in order to trick users into installing it, that is a Trojan horse. Trojans rely on deception. For example, a user downloads what appears to be a free video player application, but the software secretly installs a remote access backdoor in the background. That is a Trojan because the malicious software pretended to be legitimate. A common exam trap is assuming Trojans self-replicate like viruses or worms. Trojans do not spread on their own. They depend on social engineering and user installation. Now let's move into one of the most financially damaging malware types. If the question describes malware encrypting files and demanding payment to restore access, you are dealing with ransomware. For example, an employee suddenly loses access to company documents and sees a message demanding cryptocurrency payment in exchange for the decryption key. That is ransomware. Ransomware attacks commonly target hospitals, schools, businesses, government agencies. Because downtime creates pressure to pay quickly. Now let's transition into spyware. If a scenario describes malware secretly monitoring user activity, collecting information, or capturing browsing behavior, you are dealing with spyware. For example, spyware may secretly record keystrokes, collect login credentials, or monitor websites visited by the victim. A common form of spyware is a keylogger, which records keyboard activity to steal usernames and passwords. Now let's move into rootkits because these are often tested as stealth-focused malware. If the question describes malware designed to hide itself and maintain privileged access to a system, you are dealing with a rootkit. Rootkits are designed to avoid detection while giving attackers deep system control. For example, a rootkit may modify operating system functions to hide malicious files and processes from antivirus software and administrators. Rootkits are particularly dangerous because they can allow attackers to remain hidden inside systems for long periods of time. Now let's discuss logic bombs. If a scenario describes malicious code that activates only when specific conditions are met, you are dealing with a logic bomb. For example, a disgruntled employee may plant malicious code programmed to delete company files if their user account is disabled. The malware remains inactive until the trigger condition occurs. The key phrase to recognize is delayed or condition-based activation. Now let's move into botnets. If the question describes large numbers of infected systems remotely controlled by attackers, you are dealing with a botnet. Individual infected devices are commonly called bots or zombies. For example, attackers may compromise thousands of computers and use them together to launch a distributed denial of service, or DDoS, attack against a website. A common exam clue is centralized remote control of many infected systems. Now let's talk about malware indicators, because the exam often asks you to recognize signs of compromise. Common malware indicators include unusually slow system performance, unexpected pop-up windows, unauthorized account activity, disabled antivirus software, excessive network traffic, encrypted or inaccessible files, unknown applications or processes, browser redirects, system crashes or instability. For example, if employees report that files suddenly cannot be opened and all file names now include strange extensions, ransomware may be present. If systems begin communicating with unfamiliar external servers, spyware or botnet activity may be occurring. Now let's bring everything together using recognition patterns. If malware attaches itself to legitimate files and requires user action, think virus. If malware spreads automatically across networks, think worm. If malicious software disguises itself as legitimate software, think Trojan horse. If files are encrypted for payment, think ransomware. If user activity is secretly monitored, think spyware. If malware hides itself while maintaining privileged access, think rootkit. If malicious code activates under specific conditions, think logic bomb. And if many infected systems are remotely controlled together, think botnet. The most important takeaway is to focus on behavior. Viruses attach, worms spread, Trojans disguise themselves. Ransomware encrypts, spyware monitors, rootkits hide, logic bombs wait for triggers, botnets coordinate attacks. If you can recognize those behaviors and connect them to real-world scenarios, you'll be able to quickly eliminate incorrect answers and confidently identify the correct malware type on the exam.